Today, we are going to talk about talking to people, which is every engineer's favorite thing to do. Okay, so we are going to start with a little hand-raising exercise. Raise your hand if you paid attention fully in the last meeting that you were in, like beginning to end. Okay, small handful of hands. Raise your hand if you remained fully engaged in the last deeply technical meeting that you were in. Okay, a few more. All right. Okay. Raise your hand if you don't like meetings. All right. That's what I figured. Okay. This is because so many meetings suck. Even if they aren't a waste of time, even if they have a good purpose, they have an agenda, they check all of those sort of initial boxes, still so many meetings suck. I'm Allison McMillan. The best compliment that I ever got was that I run meetings like I hate meetings. And I am a big believer in the fact that so many meetings, gatherings, and sessions that we do together in groups are bad because they just sort of happen instead of being facilitated in thoughtful ways. A little bit about me. I am on the Ruby Central board. I had a podcast about being a parent in tech called Parent Driven Development. And for my day job, I help people have better conversations. I do that by doing one-on-one advising and mentoring as a fractional VP of engineering, and by running offsites, retreats, facilitation, strategic planning, strategy and prioritization days, all of those kinds of conversations. Two super quick mentions. We are looking for a new Ruby Central board member. So this is the application link. I can also put it in Slack afterwards. If you are interested or curious, feel free to talk to me. And I'm also hiring a principal software engineer role for one of the companies that I'm a fractional VP of engineering at. So also ping me if you want more information there. Okay. Much of what's written about meetings gives really starter suggestions, right? They offer things like have an agenda, think about the attendee list, think about the cadence of the meetings. And all of those things are really important, but that is where it starts, right? Running a meeting, especially a technical one, is so much more than that. Here's some information about meetings. 71% of senior managers believe that meetings are inefficient. How workers feel about the effectiveness of meetings correlates with their general satisfaction or dissatisfaction with their job. Almost 40% of employees consider unproductive meetings to be the highest cost to their organizations. 62% say that meetings miss opportunities to actually bring the team closer together. And only half of all meetings are effective, well-used, and engaging. And those numbers drop even lower when it comes to remote meetings. But meetings are also necessary, right? Especially the ones where we're talking about technical approaches, feasibility, postmortems, next steps, right? All of those meetings are necessary and really important. So I would love for folks to shout out some of the reasons why your last technical meeting was helpful. Context.
Drove a decision.
Design. Oh, there were a couple there at once. Clarity. All right. Service issues. Great.
Space to vent.
Nice. Okay, so here are some of mine. 2 brains are better than 1. More brains better than fewer. We can build upon each other's approaches. It's a tool for teaching, learning, and knowledge sharing. And it decreases that lottery factor, right? What happens if someone wins the lottery and leaves tomorrow? Who else knows about that part of the code base? And these skills are also really critical to career growth, right? It's something that you do more and more as you grow in seniority. At some point, your career becomes a little bit less about hands-on coding. It's not just about writing and shipping code. It's about getting people on the same page. It's about creating alignment. It's about solving some of the gnarliest problems that your company is seeing, and you're helping to unstuck or unblock others. Right? When engineers come to me to talk about that next promotion, or they're trying to figure out how to level up, more often than not, this is the skill set that's their primary growth edge. How many people here have recently led a technical conversation or discussion in any way to turn a path forward, new feature functionality? Good number of folks. What would people say about the last technical meeting that you ran? Would they say it was informative, that there were a lot of rabbit holes that we went down, that it was just the same people talking, that it was a little chaotic, that it was interesting, inclusive, that it ended without action items? A lot of these conversations are usually really frontal, right? You share your screen, you talk through an idea, you ask for comments or feedback. Sometimes you provide a pre-read. Sometimes people actually read that pre-read. Sometimes it's, a Loom walkthrough in advance. Did you know that employees multitask in at least 41% of meetings? You are potentially multitasking right now. And we know that especially in remote meetings, right, we're always fighting against dozens of other distractions. What if all of the reactions to your meetings could be things like, it was really engaging, super informative, I had a chance to provide my own approach, I felt really comfortable sharing my opinion, we walked through current thinking and approach and understanding? And it's possible. Facilitation is a superpower, and I'm going to share some of the steps today that you can use. So first, in order to facilitate, you first need to think really deeply about the conversation that you're having. This goes beyond having an agenda or an outline. This is the purpose. Think really deeply about the purpose, because not every conversation is the same, right? Even when you're looking at technical conversations, every feature approach, every retro, every let's talk about this brittle part of our code base is a little bit different. What do you want from people? Are you looking to explain your idea? Are you looking to generate a variety of approaches and ideas? Are you looking to solicit criticism or feedback about risks or what could go wrong? Do you want to give people enough context to join the work? All of those are different purposes for the same sort of technical conversation or subject matter. And then prepare yourself. What's the structure of the meeting going to be? How will you ensure that people are actually following what you're saying? How will you get the diverse opinions in the room, right? How will you limit that person who's always taking over the conversation from doing so? And how will you hear from that person who's really quiet, but who usually has really good ideas? And how will you get the opinion of that person who always has one, but frequently doesn't bring it up until it's too late, and then it feels like in order to address that concern, you have to take 10 steps back? Next, you want to articulate that vision. Let people know what those core questions are that you want to ask and what the purpose of the meeting is. This gives folks a chance to prepare themselves and a chance to narrow their mindset to the purpose of the meeting. It sets the expectations, which also allows you to keep the time really focused and engaged. If everyone knows why they're at the meeting, when you go down rabbit holes, you can bring them back to the purpose. Now, there are two approaches, or two ways to sort of think about making meetings really engaging and interesting to accomplish your goals. The first are modalities. These are sort of exercises or things that you can do. And the second are instructions or framing, right? So how people are having these conversations. I'm going to talk about modalities first. I'm going to give you 5 modalities. Again, modality is like a fancy word for an exercise that you can utilize with your groups. Okay, so the first exercise that you can do is to have people think about different approaches to the problem. The goal here is to come up with a massive quantity of ideas because you need a critical mass of ideas, including a whole lot of bad ones, to pick out the good ones. You can do this by providing a technical approach first and then having people sort of play around with that approach using a question like, how would you change this approach? Think of all the ways. Or you can present people with a problem that you're trying to solve, and then people can brainstorm different solutions, right? These ideas will have varying levels of technical feasibility, right? Some are going to be like, no, that's not possible. And some are like, oh, interesting. But that's the goal, right? And you can encourage this through thinking through a handful of different prompts that really help people think outside the box. Another modality and a different approach is that you can have people list out the risks and concerns that they have of a certain technical approach, either out loud or in Post-its first, and then have them circle the one that they think is the most probable. And then the conversation beyond that becomes, how are you mitigating that or diminishing that particular risk, right? What can be done, thought of, or changed to alleviate those feelings or concerns? Okay, how might we's? This exercise is sort of really a reframe. When you're solving a problem, phrase it as how might we statements. You can also toss this to participants and you can say like, hey, how about you all come up with a few how might we statements as a way of determining the different things that you actually need to discuss and decide about. And anything can be a how might be, right? So some examples might be, how might we build X feature? Or how might we have resolved this incident faster? How might we make X part of our code base more stable and reliable? You can also use how might we's when you're not coming up with a specific technical approach. Something like, how might we alleviate concerns about a risky approach or a less than ideal technical solution that we needed to put in place because of a time frame promise? Never done that, right? Or how might we understand what solutions fit within our constraints? Fourth option, if you're not looking to open up the conversation so widely, is to present an approach and then have the participants change one thing about it. To change one thing shapes the constraints and narrows down what people are thinking. It allows for additional participation because the barrier to entry is much lower, right? People don't have to be like, okay, do I understand this entire approach, this entire thing to make changes, to come up with new ideas, et cetera, right? It's really, they don't have to think about all those complex risks and mitigations. It's just, can they think of one aspect or one approach, one thing that they would change and that they would alter to improve the approach in some way and explain why. And lastly, utilize the virtual whiteboards, especially for folks that are remote. We love a good virtual whiteboard, even though we still know there isn't a great one in tech. We're still working on that. And we're really good at virtual Post-it noting. So create a board that has different sections on it. At the top of each section, frame a question that you want the group to discuss and answer. Now, what these questions or sections will be will vary wildly based on the purpose of your meeting, but they should be answerable with a variety of ideas that are short enough to fit on one Post-it note, like one Post-it note per one idea. And then you can do a lot of things with that. You can group them, you can discuss, sort of figure out where to go from there. These exercises, approaches, these modalities are important for a number of reasons that, again, build on some of the success factors that we talked about earlier. They give more ideas a chance. At least 30% of workers believe that their ideas are shut down far too quickly in meetings. They allow people to build on each other's ideas. They enable creativity and creative thinking and solutioning. And they foster a deeper sense of curiosity and discovery. All of these are sort of initial approaches, right? You start with these kinds of exercises to get people talking, engaging, and interacting. And then you start narrowing down those ideas to figure out, like, okay, what actually fits within our constraints? What feels actually realistic or interesting, etc. It's a slightly different set of exercises and approaches that I'm not going to go into today to make sure you're getting to those specific next steps and action items, but they're things like dot voting or a number of other ideas that really sort of take a large set of inputs and start narrowing them down. The other way to do this is through instructions. So the instructions are the way that people participate in these modalities. Instructions and varied instructions are great for introverts, for neurodiverse folks, and for greater engagement of everyone, right? If I were to like TLDR this section, I would say not all discussions need to be large group discussions. By varying the instructions and the way that folks are participating, not just what they're participating in, you're accommodating different personalities, different learning styles, different thought processes to create a more inclusive atmosphere and ensure that all voices are being heard and considered. So what do I mean by instructions? So here's an example. When you're having people discuss a question or an approach, again, it could be a specific question in your overall sort of technical meeting or a larger technical approach, break it up into parts. First, give a minute or two for people to think on their own and get their thoughts together. Then have them talk with a pair to share those ideas. Then have two pairs get together for a small group of 4 and have the small groups discuss. And then have each of the small groups sort of share with a larger group their thoughts. Right? There's a progression here, and it allows people to participate in different levels and makes your meeting way more dynamic, more effective, and more efficient because not everyone has to share their thought in a large group. And you don't have to do the entire progression, right? Frequently, just having people chat in pairs can be really effective. Or maybe they're in pairs and then they go back to the big group and then they go back into those same pairs for like a next discussion, or you mix up the pairs, right? It depends a little bit on the size of your group, what you're trying to achieve, etc. Or chatting in small groups is helpful, right? You can go right into that, and then small groups can summarize their concern or like what is the one thing that they want to bring to. So they're not summarizing their whole conversation, but they as a small group have to decide what's the one thing that we want to bring to the larger group for further thinking and discussion. This is all to say that having conversations in a large group isn't bad. Portions in a large group can also be good. But I would say if you're having large group discussions, especially remotely, you can use some of those remote tools to your advantage. So for example, you can use emojis to your benefit to ask people to be reacting to things regularly in the chat. It also has the side benefit if you have like a very like chatty chat group, it has a side benefit of keeping some of those side threads to a minimum because people know that the chat is actually going to be used for the purpose of like advancing the primary discussion that you're trying to have. Okay. I know there are probably some of you in this room who are thinking about all the reasons that this wouldn't work. Maybe it's because there's a level of unfamiliarity here or a level of skepticism about these kinds of exercises and how effective they would be in technical discussions and situations. And facilitating conversations can also be really scary because you have to let everyone in, right? All of those different personalities that we talked about before, they're all part of the conversation. And sometimes it's just easier to give a presentation and hope there aren't too many questions. So here's how you can avoid some of the most common conversation facilitation pitfalls. First is through feedback and how feedback is phrased. So we talked about how might we's a little bit before in terms of like how you can frame questions in the discussion, but also phrasing feedback through how might we statements or what are all the ways in which or I'm curious about can all be really powerful. They can help reframe, rephrase, and refocus what someone is asking. It feels more constructive. It might feel a little forced to sort of require this, like require these sentence starters at the beginning, but it also it really helps individuals be more succinct in their thoughts as well, because they have to specifically figure out what question they're asking, as opposed to like word vomiting a bunch of thoughts at you or the rest of the group. Next is knowing when to move on. Establish a parking lot. Explain what the parking lot is at the beginning so everyone's aware. This is the parking lot. When something comes up that we want to talk about more, but that doesn't fit into the specific purpose of this conversation, again, you get to bring it back to your purpose because you've set and established your purpose already. So you can use that purpose as a tool. You can say, it doesn't fit into the specific purpose of this conversation. We're going to add it to the parking lot. And then we'll blah, 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 right? Like you can explain when the parking lot will be revisited. It usually is not in the same meeting. So you can focus on your purpose and constantly bring it back to that. Next are rabbit holes. The parking lot can be one successful way to deal with a rabbit hole. The other is by taking a kind of poll from the group. So after a few minutes, when it feels like the group probably has enough context on this topic, again, for the purposes of this conversation, but it seems like the conversation is still continuing, you can ask the group for a thumbs up, thumbs down, or middle thumb on if you should continue the current conversation thread. So up is yes, down is no, middle is meh, I could go either way. The other way that I use this sometimes is when someone really wants to talk about something and I'm not sure if it will or won't add to the conversation. So it's not an easy like, okay, let's talk about this and then do thumbs, or like, okay, let's parking lot this. I'll say something like, I'll time box it. So I'll say something like, okay, I'm putting 4 minutes on the clock for this conversation. When the timer chimes, everyone do thumbs so that we know if we should move on or add a few more minutes to the clock for this conversation thread. And it's really like the timer chimes, I go thumbs, and everyone just holds up. So it's a very quick sort of like glance of, okay, cool. The next pitfall is when no one knows what's being talked about, but everyone is pretending that they do. You can recognize this because there's often complete silence when questions are asked or when asked for questions. A good solution here is to take like a 5-minute break and ask for questions to anonymously or semi-anonymously be sent to you as folks go on to break, right? You can say something like, what's something you need clarity on? You know, you can open up, like, feel free to post a question or send me a question like, I lost you at X part, etc. And then you can review them sort of pretty quickly during the break. And as folks get back, you can reset, you can clarify, you can update on, you know, terms, approaches, questions, etc. Finally, the ultimate pitfall is having a lot of conversation without any actual action items or getting to any sort of a conclusion. Really need to get to decisions and next steps. This is the part that so many meetings miss on. Right? You have to end with action items and next steps. When conversations seem to be going in different directions, you can try a recap, right? What I'm hearing is, do we have any specific actions we want to take or decisions we want to put in front of everyone? My like spicy hot take is that if your meeting doesn't end with action items or next steps, maybe it shouldn't have been a meeting. Okay. So take a moment to think, or you can write this down if you have a notebook handy. One thing I want to try in my next technical group conversation is. One thing I want to try in my next technical group conversation is. Here's what I hope you try. I hope you try a new to you approach that encourages more participation. I hope that you try sitting in silence for a little bit longer than you're comfortable with. I hope you try developing your gut sense of when a conversation is on track or off track. And I hope you try some new approaches to re-engage people when you start to notice that they're obviously doing something else without calling them out, right? Because that's the worst. Nobody wants to be called out. And your goal is not to embarrass them, it's to engage them. So the next time that you feel like you're talking too much, you probably are, deploy one of these methods to allow others' ideas, opinions, thoughts, and reactions to surface. You won't regret it. You'll develop your own facilitator superpowers. I'd love to answer questions for folks. You can find me in the hallway around the conference today. I think we might have a couple minutes for questions. I look like this. I'm also happy to help or answer any questions after the conference, because really helping people plan and facilitate effective meetings, retreats, offsites, etc. is my most favorite thing to do in the whole entire world. Thank you. Questions? Did I mention that I do one-on-one advising and mentoring? So I think that you can start by being like, hey, that meeting was really interesting. I'm curious how you think it went, or I'm curious what your goals of the meeting were, right? How can I help you achieve those? You can sometimes be like, oh, I saw this conference talk. It might be interesting to try a few of these things in our next. It might be interesting to try a few of these things in our next meeting, because sometimes actually your managers don't think that they are running a meeting well, but they don't know any other way, right? And so they just run meetings how they're like, well, we have to have a meeting, so I guess this is how we're going to do it, right? So I would say at least half the time, they're also not thrilled with how it's going, but they just don't know any different or how to sort of try other things. So you could sort of try in that way, I'm curious what the goals are. I want to help achieve those goals, right? Those sorts of things. Yeah.
What's a gentle way to call people out who are multitasking, like I was, during meetings?
Yeah. Sometimes it's usually not just one person. So sometimes I'll say something like, hey, just a reminder, let's really focus so that we're making the most because nobody likes a wasted meeting, right? So sometimes I'll be like, hey, let's make sure that windows are closed so that we're focusing on our purpose here. Sometimes I'll say it looks like we need 5 minutes so that people can just dive into and then put to bed anything that they're sort of wrapping up. I do it also when running offsites. I always suggest that sort of the day before, there's a strong encouragement to say wrap up any threads that you think might be distracting. So also if you're going to a longer workshop session, a 3-hour, right, you can also put that in the morning. To prepare for the workshop today, make sure your mental threads that might take you elsewhere are wrapped up. Make sure that you set your Slack status so that you don't feel bad about not answering a DM, right? But you can also say if it looks like you're losing everyone, you can say, let's take 5 and then come back. Yes. This is death by report out. So this is where, sometimes in small groups, you can say what's the one idea? The other thing that I'll do is start a sentence prompt and then model it. So on this slide, one thing I want to try in my next technical conversation is if we were doing that, let's say we had 10 people and I wanted everyone to do that as a closing, I would model it. I would say, finish the sentence, no run-ons, no ands, buts, etc., no multi-sentences. One thing I want to try in my next technical conversation is I would role model it. And then as the next 1 or 2 people go, if somebody doesn't start with that sentence prompt and finish, I would say, just as a reminder, we're starting with the sentence starter and ending with a period, which feels really rigid, but people very much appreciate it. I'm gonna go back there.
We use the parking lot in our meeting, and I think I heard you say that you suggest using the parking lot items for a separate meeting. I'm just curious why I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's just a matter of when you want to revisit the part. Like if the purpose of the meeting isn't to address the things in the parking lot. Now the parking lot doesn't always have to be addressed through a separate meeting, right? Sometimes it might be like, okay, we can take these things to a Slack thread. Or if there's time at the end of the meeting, it could be like, okay, we have 5 parking lot items. Like which of these do we want to spend the 10 extra minutes that we have in this meeting moving into? But you generally don't want to try to, the parking lot is specifically like, these are things that are not relevant to this meeting. So you don't necessarily, especially if the meeting is going to like go overtime or things like that, you don't want to dive into the parking lot for that reason. And with that, I think that I'm overtime, actually. So thank you all.